with part 4 now on our acoelomates and pseudocoelomates, and we are still within the realm of the acoelomates here, picking up with the flatworms, which we started back at the end of section 3. And so, with the flatworms, we're actually going to see the first now of our parasitic species. Now, not all flatworms are parasitic. There are some that are free-living, and we'll talk about some of the jobs they do out in nature here in a little bit. But some of the flatworms are actually parasitic, and that even includes some that are parasites on humans. So those are usually, pretty interesting as well. This picture here, by the way, is a free-living flatworm. It's known as a turbolarian, and we'll talk about the taxonomy of this group here shortly as well. But it is one of the free-living groups of flatworms. We talked about the idea of these having an incomplete digestive tract. So that means that the GI tract only has one opening, as opposed to two that we see in most other organisms. So a very simple and rudimentary gut in most, and in some, they of course have no gut at all. And we talked about the tapeworms and the fact that they're the most advanced of the flatworms in that they don't have a GI tract at all. As far as those that are free-living, you can find them in just about every habitat possible. So we can see marine, freshwater, fairly moist terrestrial. They don't do real well in very dry places. And then, of course, parasitic as well. Some of the free-living flatworms can be very brightly colored, as these two are in this picture here. Most of them are not going to be this color at all. They're going to be more of a drab, brownish, or grayish color, but there are some that are brightly colored that you can find from time to time as well. A structure we haven't seen yet so far is a structure called a pharynx. Pharynx, just in very general terms, is a food processing organ. So in the case of flatworms, this structure is used to tear up bits of food into smaller pieces to make it more easily digested. So pharynx can be very, very diverse depending on the kind of organism you're looking at. Humans have a pharynx as well. Our pharynx is essentially the back part of our mouth and the top part of our throat. But in the case of the flatworms, for those that have one, their pharynx is actually protrusible, meaning they can stick it out of their body. And it actually sticks out about halfway down their body. We'll see if we can see one back here on this picture. Yeah, the pharynx is going to be like right back here at the end of the structure. One of these two ends here is going to be the pharynx, which they can then, like I said, protrude out of their body and use it to chew up whatever bits of food they've come across. So kind of bizarre from our perspective, but of course for them it's completely normal. Not a whole lot of complexity in terms of other systems. There is no circulatory system, which means all circulation of nutrients and waste has to be through diffusion, which we've seen before. Not a super efficient process. It's cheap, but it's also not very efficient, which means the size of flatworms is going to be limited accordingly due to their lack of a circulatory system. No respiratory system either. So again, diffusion is really all they have when it comes to moving gases around inside the body. We do see, like I said before, the pharynx and the mouth about halfway back on the body in some of these, for those that have a pharynx and a mouth. Tapeworms, of course, don't. But for the others, the free-living ones, they're going to have the ability to chew up food and then bring it into their body through their pharynx. There is primarily extracellular digestion, like we saw before, beginning in the cnidarians. Food is broken down outside of the cells, and the cells then grab whatever food particles, whatever nutrients they can find, through phagocytosis, which is not exactly how humans do things, but a much more similar process to what we do than, say, what sponges do. Sponges are completely different, right? They have to bring in food particles and digest them inside the cells. All the other animals break down and digest the food outside the cells, right? So a big difference there when it comes to sponges versus all the other groups. And like I said, we talked about the tapeworms. Don't have a GI tract. They essentially absorb nutrients right through their body wall, which means, number one, the body wall's got to be very thin, but number two, the food has to be broken down for them already. And that's why living inside the GI tract of another organism, like a vertebrate, is going to work for them. So we've got, sort of the similar picture to what we saw before with our turbolarian up here on the top. And then we have a cross-section through its body as well, where we can see the fact that it is monoecious, so it's both male and female, has both testes and ovaries, oviducts here, part of an ovary. Sperm ducts as well, so both male and female. These have both longitudinal and circular muscles, so going to be somewhat more complex when it comes to musculature than, say, the roundworms, but less complex than, say, the segmented worms are. And then a few other structures are the intestine, nerve cords, which run in parallel chains down the length of the body, and then epidermis as well. So not super complex in the grand scheme of things compared to most animals, but way more complex when it comes to comparing them to, say, the cnidarians or the sponges. We see a lot of parallel structure in flatworms. So we have the intestine running down through the middle of the body here, but then we have a parallel nervous system and parallel reproductive structures as well. Notice how there really isn't a centralized nervous system. There's what's called a cerebral ganglion, which is clusters of neurons. So more neurons up here in the front end than we find in the rest of the body, but it's also not as advanced as you might, call a brain or a spinal cord. It's not anywhere near that centralized as we would see, say, in a vertebrate. So really not getting anywhere close to the complexity of nervous system that we're going to see in some of the more advanced animals. We talked also in the third section about osmoregulation, so maintaining water balance, and also the process of excretion. These guys and girls, they're both flatworms, have what are called flame cells or protonephridia in side branches on the intestine. So if we jump back a second here, this intestine is going to have all these little side branches, and at the end of these side branches are going to be those flame cells or protonephridia. And so what those are going to do is to move water and whatever sort of nitrogenous waste might be produced into the tubules and then eventually into the intestine as well, from which they can be expelled, right? So the intestine opens up back into the environment, and whatever waste have been dumped into the intestine can be moved out of the body from that structure as well. So the metabolic waste, which would be things like ammonia, for example, would come out into the gut first, and then eventually from the mouth. Remember, they only have one opening, so it's either ingestion or excretion at any one point in time from that same structure from the mouth in the case of the flatworms. We talked about central nervous system, the ganglion. They do have eye spots, which you may have noticed back either on the photograph or on the illustration, which makes especially the free-living flatworms look to be sort of cross-eyed, sort of cute. But they're very, very simple light detecting structures. Basically, they can see light versus dark, but their eyes don't have any sort of a lens or a retina or anything like that. So they're not capable of forming images, right? They can't see your face if you stand above one of them and look at them. They can tell that maybe there's a bit of a shadow that you cast because of your body blocking the light or whatever, but they can't perceive or resolve any more detail than that. It's just light versus dark in the case of those. And for those that are parasitic, both the flukes and the tapeworms, they don't have eye spots at all, right? So they live inside the gut of a vertebrate host. It's dark in there, so having eye spots would be completely pointless for them, and they've actually evolved to have lost those structures as they've gone through their progression evolutionarily. Reproduction, like we said, most of these are hermaphroditic. They're able to, in most cases, cross-fertilize, in some cases self-fertilize, as in the case of the tapeworms, but most of these species are both male and female at the same time. And again, this is one of those things where, if you're living inside the gut of some sort of vertebrate host, chances of you finding another one of your species are pretty slim. And so on those odd occasions when you do come across a member of your species, you really don't want to have to find like a specific sex partner, right? If you're male, you don't have to want to worry about finding a female. And if you're female, you don't have to worry about finding a male because everybody is both. So since the odds of finding a mate are relatively slim, it really helps to maximize the reproductive output if everybody is both male and female. So if you do happen to encounter a member of your species, you can fertilize them, they can fertilize you, and you get more reproductive output because the chances of you reproducing again are probably pretty slim. For the tapeworms, they fertilize themselves, so they don't even have to have a partner for fertilization. They just essentially are egg factories that we'll see here in a bit. We talked about the fact that most of these are able to fragment and reproduce asexually that way. That is because they are relatively simple. Their bodies are not so specialized that if you cut off the back half of one, it contains any structures that you wouldn't find in the front half. They're fairly homogeneous throughout their body. So if you have pieces of a flatworm, chances are, if it was in good shape before it was fragmented, all those pieces might fragment into a fully grown flatworm eventually. Now, as far as the groups, we are in the phylum Platyhelminthes, and we are going to look at two subphyla. All right, so this is a group between phylum and class. So in this case, kingdom, phylum, subphylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the first of the two subphyla is the Turbellaria, which we mentioned before. The Turbellaria is a group which is probably not monophyletic. Now, this is a situation where we talked about this back in our first chapter. The group of organisms that are currently classified as turbellarians is probably not complete. In other words, there are probably turbellarians out there that are currently classified with other groups because they look like some other group, even though, genetically speaking and evolutionarily speaking, they actually are more closely related to turbellarians. So there's still a lot of work being done with this group to try to get them pinned down to a single, common ancestor and all the descendants sort of monophyletic group. Dukesia, or what used to be called planaria, is the one that we saw the illustration of, the one that we saw the photograph of, the one that looks sort of cross-eyed. That is a very, very common species that we see in biology labs. Not at all uncommon to see that one under a microscope and draw it and maybe do some other sorts of even behavioral experiments on these. They're not uncommon in gen bio labs. The other subphylum is the subphylum Neodermata. So within the Platyhelminthes, we have the Turbellaria, which are all free-living, and we have the Neodermata, which are all parasitic. And then within the Neodermata, there are two classes, the Trematoda, which are the flukes, and the Circummeromorpha, which are the tapeworms. All right, so we're going to look at some examples of both of these. Both of these have ways to attach to the inside part of their host, as we'll see, either suckers or anchors or hooks of some kind. In many cases, the parasitic forms are going to have at least two hosts, if not more than two hosts. We'll talk about some parasitology as well here. Really good example of a trematode is Clonorchis sinensis, which is the oriental liver fluke. This is one that actually parasitizes humans. There's another one called schistosoma, which we'll talk about as well, which causes a very important disease called schistosomiasis in humans. And then we also have, we'll take a look at the human tapeworm as well and talk about its life cycle. Its name is Taenia saginata, which is specifically the human tapeworm. And there are tapeworms of most other vertebrates as well, but that happens to be the one that does the best in humans. So with the Turbellaria, like we said, these are free-living. These do not have to have a host. They're out there in the environments, either aquatic in some way or perhaps terrestrial, as long as it's not too dry. It's really key for them to have some degree of moisture so they don't dry out. Right, they've got a very thin epidermis. They do so because they have to be able to breathe through their skin. So therefore, the other side of that coin is, yeah, they can breathe through their skin, but their skin's also very, very prone to losing water and for them to desiccate or dry out and die as a result. So they need to have some moisture around them for them to be able to survive. These can be fairly large. They can be kind of colorful in some cases. They're a reasonably diverse group, but we don't really see them that often. Right? They're pretty secretive. They're typically in places where we don't tend to encounter them too often. For those that are free-living, in terms of what they do in the environment, we talk a lot about the niche of an organism. And I know that a lot of times people will pronounce that niche, which is fine, but in ecology we typically pronounce it the other way as niche. A niche is like an organism's ecological job. It's its role in the environment. It's what it does to make a living in the environment. If it's a predator, if it's a parasite, if it's a decomposer, if it's a detritivore, and the difference between those two we'll get to here in a second as well. That is their niche in the environment. And we can get more specific. We can talk about where they live. We can talk about what time of day or year they're active. The niche can be very, very specific, but really for these guys, for the free-living ones, there is a variety of niches for free-living flatworms. They can be herbivores. They can feed on producers, essentially. They can be carnivores, and there are some that are detritivores. All right, so the difference between a detritivore and a decomposer is this. A detritivore is typically an animal. And so detritivores are things that break down dead organic matter kind of the first go-around. They take the first pass at it. So when you see earthworms breaking down leaf litter in the forest, that is a detritivorous niche. They're breaking down the leaf particles into smaller bits, and then the decomposers take over. Decomposers are typically microbes. So they're going to be things like bacteria. They're going to be things like fungi. They're going to take the partially digested detritus that was eaten by things like flatworms or segmented worms, and they're going to break it down into its actual component nutrients. So by the time the bacteria and the fungi are done, you actually have like raw nitrogen and carbon and actual nutrients going back into the soil or back into the water after the decomposers get done with it. So detritivores are first, usually animals, and then eventually decomposers take over from there. Now, with the trematodes, we've got two main groups here, right? So we've got the flukes. Good example of that, like I said, is Clonorchis sinensis, the oriental liver fluke. We're going to talk about the life cycle of these. Now, one thing that you find in parasites is that their life cycles can be extremely complex. And you're maybe going to think this life cycle is a little bit complex, even for Clonorchis sinensis. Take my word for it, it's one of the less complex of the parasites. There are some that will go through 4 or 5 hosts in very complex ways. Both Clonorchis sinensis and schistosoma, which is the other one that we're going to look at in the trematodes, are like an easy to medium life cycle for a parasite to have. So Just bear that in mind as we work through this. Parasitology is a fascinating subject. If you ever get a chance to take a course in it, there are some really amazing ways that animals have to make a living. Dealing with living inside the body of another animal is a pretty amazing way to make a living. So there's all kinds of challenges that come along with that. There's some benefits of it as well, certainly, but there's a lot of challenges that come along with this as well. Now, with Clonorchus sinensis, we're going to start with the egg phase. And with any life cycle, whether in this course, whether it's plants, whether it's animals, doesn't matter, a life cycle is a cycle, right? It's essentially a circular pathway to make your way through a living or a life of an organism. So it doesn't really matter where you start. There is really not technically a beginning as long as you make it through the entire thing. So we don't actually have to start with the egg phase, but that's kind of how I have this description set up for Clonorchus sinensis. So we've got a human host, Homo sapiens, right? That's our species and genus. We've got a host which is infested with Clonorchus sinensis. Typically, when you say infestation, that refers to animals inhabiting something, like parasites, for example. If you talk about infection, that generally means virus, bacteria, fungus, microbe, or smaller kind of a thing with infection. So with parasites, we talk about infestation. So we're going to imagine now we've got a human infested with Clonorchus sinensis. The parasite is reproduced, and there are now eggs exiting the body in the feces. A lot of the parasites we're going to see in this course are going to have an exit point from the GI tract, meaning from the anus. Okay, so the eggs are coming out of the body in the feces, and they're going to make their way into the environment. Now, specifically for Clonorchus sinensis and Schistosoma, so what we're going to see is Schistosoma has very much a parallel life cycle to Clonorchus. The eggs have to make their way to water. If the eggs are on dry land, they're not going to do anything. They can stay sort of in suspended animation for a little while in the dry environment, but they can't really progress beyond the egg phase if they're not in water, specifically fresh water. So we're going to assume that Clonorchus sinensis eggs have made their way into the water. Maybe it's rain and it's washed some of these eggs into a local stream or pond or lake. Some of those eggs are going to hatch, and they're going to form the next stage of the life cycle called a miracidium. Miracidium is singular, miracidia is plural. And so that's pretty typical to see that. If you have a name that ends in M for the singular form, it will end in A for the plural form. So miracidium is singular, miracidia is plural. Same thing with phylum and phyla. Phylum is one, phyla are more than one. Same idea. So miracidia are free swimming. They are ciliated, very, very small microscopic larvae of Clonorchus sinensis. Now, one of two things can happen here. Either the miracidium itself is actually going to burrow into the body tissues of a snail, or in some cases the snail will actually eat the eggs directly, which also works for Clonorchus sinensis. So once the miracidium, or the egg, has made its way into the body of the snail, the parasite is going to make its way into the gut of the snail. It's actually now in the snail's tissues. At that point, you kind of think of it as a larva. It's not technically a larva, but it's an immature form of the parasite. Is going to transition now into what's called a sporocyst. Now you got to imagine that even if Clonorchus sinensis released 1,000,000 eggs from a human host, the chances of one of those eggs getting into water, excuse me, finding a snail, burrowing through the gut, getting into the body tissues, is pretty slim. So even though they started with 1,000,000 eggs, maybe only one or two of them actually makes it to the next stage in the sporocyst form. The sporocyst job is to multiply within the body of the snail. So that one sporocyst that came from one miracidium can then multiply itself into about 30 or so of the next stage, which are called redia. So in this case, redia is singular, and redii, with the e at the end of it, redii is plural. So one miracidium forms one sporocyst, which then transitions into about 30 or so redii, which are now the next stage. All right, so we've gone from egg to miracidium to sporocyst to redia. Like I said, this is easy to medium for a parasite, so this isn't even a really complex one. It's kind of in the middle, so to speak, of complexity. Now the redia, once they're mature enough, are going to transition into the last stage of the parasite, in the immature stage at least, called the cercaria. Cercaria singular, cercariae is plural. So cercariae are then going to be able to infect or infest the next host. Now the next host is not a human. Yeah, the next host is actually going to be a fish of some form. Specifically for Clonorchus sinensis, a fish in the minnow family, so the cyprinid minnows. Cyprinidae is a family of fish that includes the minnows, cyprinidae. You don't need to know that name, it's just there. Includes things like carp. And in a lot of the world, carp are a very important dietary item for a lot of people. So these cercaria are going to find their way into the body of a large minnow or carp, at which point they're then available to be picked up by the actual primary host. All right, so we'll talk about primary versus secondary in a second. The primary host is the human. The other secondary host is the fish. All right, so the snail is secondary, the fish is secondary, the human is primary in this case. So whenever we talk about a primary host, sometimes we also call that a definitive host. Primary or definitive means this is where the parasite actually reproduces. Right? This is where they actually undergo sexual reproduction to make eggs. The secondary host is some other host in the life cycle that the parasite uses to get back to the primary host. So they can feed off the secondary host, they can grow in the secondary host, they can move out of the secondary host, but they don't reproduce in the secondary host. They only reproduce in the primary host. All right, so we've gone from egg to myristidium to sporocyst to rhedia to cercaria. Now we're back into a fish, and if that fish is consumed by a human, either uncooked or undercooked, then the parasite, the Clonorchus sinensis parasite, can get back into the human through the GI tract, through the mouth, down the esophagus, into the stomach, and eventually into the small intestine again, and that's where the parasite's going to start reproducing. Small intestine is represented by this bluish color here. It's not actually that short, but that's what they mean in this picture. This is large intestine. This is stomach. This is liver over here. But this parasite is intestinal sort of parasite. And at that point, the parasite can reproduce. More eggs come out in the feces, and the life cycle restarts itself again. Eggs go out in the water, transition to myristidium, to sporocyst, to rhedia, to cercaria in the snail, and then eventually back to the fish, and eventually again into a human. All right, so that is our life cycle for Clonorchus sinensis. The other parasite we're going to see is schistosoma, which, like I said, undergoes a very similar progression, very similar life cycle. It's not the exact same species of snail and fish, but it does basically the same thing. So different kind of secondary host, same primary host, still humans, but very very similar to what Clonorchus does. So the idea of a sporocyst, again, because sometimes it's a little bit confusing for folks, is the egg is released, assuming that the myristidium actually gets into a snail. The sporocyst can eventually produce about 30 rhedia, which then transition into about 30 cercaria. So even though one egg may have only made its way into a snail, as soon as that egg forms a sporocyst, it then re-amplifies its numbers back to about 30 or so cercaria per sporocyst. So it's a way for them to build their numbers back up again to give them a better shot at reproductive success. All right, now our other trematode that we're going to talk about, and we're going to end our section 4 on this parasite here, is schistosoma. This parasite is one of the few actually invertebrate parasites that actually has an intromittent organ, which is basically a penis, essentially, that the male has. These guys are able to attach to the inside of their human host using suckers. So they have an oral sucker, which is by their mouth. They have a ventral sucker, which is on their belly surface, about halfway back on their body. And they use those to either attach to their host or move around in their host, like sort of like an inchworm sort of a movement pattern inside their host. Now, this parasite causes a condition called schistosomiasis. And this is one that in the Western world, especially in North America, we don't really hear about it because it doesn't really exist here. But if you were to go outside of North America, it's actually a hugely important condition caused by a parasite, probably one of the most important ones of all parasites. Not as severe as some of the microbial things like malaria or something like that, but in terms of parasites, probably the most important parasitic condition in the entire world when it comes to how frequent it occurs, when it comes to the mortality rate that it causes, when it comes to disruption to quality of life and economic damage, people that are unable to work or people that are in the hospital because they're laid up with schistosomiasis. Very, very important disease. This one occurs in fresh water. And this particular parasite's a little bit different than Clonorchus sinensis because this one can actually get into your body in different ways. And depending on how it gets into your body, that determines where the parasite sort of sets up shop inside the body. So it can actually come in through your urinary tract. You kind of use your imagination on that. It can come in through your urinary tract and eventually make its way up the urethra into the bladder, where it can cause a form of schistosomiasis there. It can live in the blood vessels, and it can also live in the small intestine, much like Clonorchus did. So something unique about this group, schistosoma is actually a parasite that is sexually dimorphic. So the term sexual dimorphism means that males and females have a visually different appearance. Males and females are easily distinguishable visually. You can tell them apart just by looking at them. And the reason for that is that males are fairly big, they're sort of flat, broad sort of flatworms. Females are more roundish. They're less flat than the males are. So when a male finds a female, what he'll do is actually wrap his body around her body to ensure that they stay together for both of their lives. Because when you're living inside the gut of a host, there's constant movement of materials in the environment past you, and it could be really easy for one of the two individuals to be swept away, and then, they lose their mate, essentially. So by having the male sort of permanently with the female, that ensures that they're both able to reproduce consistently throughout their entire lives and maximize both individuals' reproductive output, which is fairly unique for a parasite. This one, schistosoma, when it has gotten to the point where it's a severe infestation, can cause a very, very severe abdominal distension, or what essentially looks like a very, very full belly. But it's actually due not so much to the parasite itself, but to the blockage of things like blood vessels, for example, can cause swelling or edema in the body. As we'll see in the roundworms, you can also have a blockage of the lymphatic system, which can cause severe swelling as well. So that's actually a fairly common symptom for schistosoma. The problem with this one is not only the distension, the discomfort, the pain that it causes when it's inhabiting the host, but also how it gets out of the host. So a lot of times, schistosoma, if it's living in, say, a blood vessel, when it's time to emerge, it will actually push its way through the walls of the blood vessel, and that will actually cause a hemorrhage inside the body. If it breaks its way through the intestines or the urinary bladder, either one, then you run the risk of severe sepsis, or essentially infection happening inside the body, poisoning inside the body as a result of this waste being released into body spaces as a result. So very, very serious condition as well when it comes to how this one makes a living. Now, you'll notice the parasite looks very similar if you go back and look at Clonorchus sinensis, very similar to Clonorchus. Same kind of a life cycle. You've got eggs, Myricydium, Sporocyst, Rhedia, Cercaria. You've got a fish, you've got a snail, you've got a human consuming this. Again, as long as the fish is uncooked or undercooked, the parasite can survive and make its way into a human. If the fish is cooked thoroughly, then the parasite is killed and the human is not infested with the parasite. So really good reason to make sure that your meat is always cooked thoroughly. It's not just because of bacterial pathogens, it's also because of possible parasites. Now, we don't run into a ton of these parasites in the US of this form, but it's always a good idea to make sure you get your meat cooked at least somewhat thoroughly to make sure that you kill off any potential pathogens or parasites that could possibly be present. This one's not common in the US, but, tapeworms are not unheard of. They're not very common, but tapeworms can happen here. But again, cooking the meat thoroughly ensures the parasites are killed off before they have a chance to infest a new host. So just a couple of other pictures here to wrap up on schistosomiasis. We've got a picture of a male. You can see the suckers, ventral and oral. This is the female poking her head out. He's kind of surrounded her body with his, but she's kind of poking her head out here so you can see her. This is the female here. Also, this is her body up here. The male's body is flattened and surrounding hers, and you kind of see them separate over here. We talked about that abdominal distension here. And this map kind of shows us overall global distribution of either hepatic or intestinal schistosomiasis, which is in blue, which you see is South America. You've got Asia, you've got the Caribbean. Urinary is mostly in Africa. Both types are throughout Africa. And the rest of the world is fairly low risk for schistosomiasis. But about 5% of the world's population is infested with this parasite. So you're looking at, 7.5 billion people that have schistosomiasis. That is not a trivial number of people with this condition. And it actually kills nearly 1 million people per year. It actually probably is 1 million people per year at this point, based on how big our population size has gotten. So it's a very serious parasite. Most parasites don't do that kind of damage to their host. This one is one that does do that. When we talked about how they get out as well, that's typically where they cause the bulk of their damage. All right, so we're going to wrap up section 3 here on the flatworms. Sorry, this is section 4 on the flatworms. And we'll start section 5 here in just a second.